In 1822, in the swamps of southern Louisiana, a man named Moses did something that should have been impossible. He killed his master, walked free, married the widow, and inherited the plantation. For 150 years, this story was dismissed as folklore, a legend whispered among freed people in Louisiana and Texas. The tale seemed too perfect, too much like wish fulfillment, the ultimate revenge fantasy of an enslaved man who not only gained his freedom, but took everything his oppressor owned. But in 1973, a graduate student researching land records in St. Mary Parish discovered something extraordinary. Deed transfers, marriage certificates, court documents, witness testimonies, all confirming that Moses was real. And the story was even stranger than the legend suggested. Moses didn't kill his master in a moment of rage. It was calculated, planned, and it took 3 years to execute. If this story inspired you and you'd like to hear more like it, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. The master's widow didn't marry Moses out of love or gratitude. She married him because she had no choice. Moses had methodically positioned himself as the only person who could save the plantation from financial collapse. And the most shocking part, the entire operation was legal. Every step Moses took was technically within the law. He exploited loopholes, manipulated debt structures, and used his master's own greed against him. This is the story of how one enslaved man engineered his freedom, his revenge, and his fortune, and why the white community that discovered what he'd done chose to let him keep it all. This is the story of Moses, the legend. St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, 1819. This was bayou country, swampland, sugarcane territory. The land was rich but brutal. Suffocating humidity, mosquitoes that carried yellow fever, floods that could destroy entire harvests in hours. William Broussard owned 800 acres along the Atchafalaya River. He'd purchased the land in 1815 with inherited money from his father, a New Orleans merchant. Broussard was 28 years old when he started his plantation. He was ambitious, intelligent, and absolutely terrible with money. He owned 12 enslaved people when he started. Moses was one of them. Purchased in 1816 at a New Orleans slave market for $900. Moses was approximately 24 years old at the time, though his exact age was never recorded. He'd been born in Virginia, sold south for punishment for insolence, according to the bill of sale, and ended up on Broussard's struggling sugar plantation. What made Moses different from the other enslaved people on the plantation was his skill set. He could read and write, rare for an enslaved person, and technically illegal in Louisiana by 1819. He could do complex mathematics, he understood accounting, and most importantly, he understood how credit, debt, and land ownership worked. Moses had learned these skills from a previous owner in Virginia, an elderly merchant who'd used Moses as a clerk before the merchant's children sold him south to settle estate debts. Moses had spent 5 years managing account books, tracking inventory, and learning the mechanics of business operations. William Broussard discovered Moses's abilities by accident. In 1817, Broussard's overseer, a man named Thibault, had been keeping sloppy records of sugar production and sales. Broussard couldn't figure out why his profits were lower than expected. One evening, working late in his study, Broussard found Moses cleaning the office. On impulse, Broussard handed Moses a ledger and asked if he could read it. Moses could. Not only that, Moses pointed out discrepancies immediately, numbers that didn't add up, missing inventory, suspicious patterns in Thibault's records. Broussard investigated and discovered Thibault had been stealing from the plantation for more than a year, skimming profits, selling sugar under the table, pocketing the difference. Broussard fired Thibault immediately and did something unique. He brought Moses into the plantation office as a clerk. This was extraordinary for 1817 Louisiana. Enslaved people working as clerks or accountants existed, but it was rare, and it created a dangerous dynamic. Moses now had access to information that enslaved people almost never saw: financial records, debt obligations, property values, the names of creditors. Moses spent the next 2 years learning everything about William Broussard's business, and what he learned was this: Broussard was drowning in debt. The plantation looked prosperous from the outside. The main house was well maintained. The fields produced decent sugar harvests, but Broussard had borrowed heavily to purchase equipment, to expand operations, to maintain appearances. He owed money to banks in New Orleans, to merchants who supplied him with goods on credit, to other plantation owners who'd loaned him cash during bad harvest years. By 1819, Broussard owed approximately $18,000, roughly $3 million, all in today's money. His annual profits were barely covering the interest payments. One bad harvest, one major equipment failure, one drop in sugar prices would trigger a cascade of defaults. Creditors would seize the property. Everything would be sold at auction. Moses saw this clearly. He watched Broussard make increasingly desperate decisions, borrowing from one creditor to pay another, selling property at losses to generate quick cash, taking risky gambles on sugar futures, and Moses began to formulate a plan. William Broussard was married to Catherine LeBlanc, daughter of a minor New Orleans merchant family. They'd married in 1816. Catherine was 19 at the time. Broussard was 25. The marriage was one of social advancement. Catherine's family had connections, and Broussard had land. Catherine Broussard was, by all accounts, an intelligent woman trapped in a suffocating situation. She had no legal rights to property. Everything belonged to her husband. She had no control over household finances, and she was watching her husband destroy their future through incompetent money management. Moses worked in the plantation house. He saw Catherine daily. He observed her frustration during arguments with her husband about money. He noticed that she understood the plantation's finances better than Broussard did. She would point out waste, suggest economies, warn about risky investments. Broussard ignored her. By 1820, Moses began having carefully orchestrated conversations with Catherine. He would be working in the office when she entered. He would leave account books open to particularly damning pages showing exactly how much debt they carried, how close they were to insolvency. He never spoke directly about the crisis. He simply made sure Catherine saw the numbers. Catherine began asking Moses questions, quietly when her husband wasn't around. How much did they owe? Who were the major creditors? What would happen if they defaulted? Moses answered honestly. They were going to lose everything, probably within 2 years, unless something changed. This was an incredibly dangerous dynamic, an enslaved man and a white woman having private conversations about her husband's failures. If anyone had reported this to Broussard, Moses would have been sold immediately, or worse, punished severely for insolence or causing dissension. But Catherine didn't report it because she'd begun to realize something. Moses understood the business better than her husband did. And Moses, unlike her husband, actually told her the truth. Then, in 1821, something changed William Broussard's behavior. He became erratic, paranoid, volatile. He started drinking heavily, something he'd done socially before, but now it was constant. He made increasingly bizarre business decisions, selling valuable equipment at losses, refusing to pay workers, alienating creditors with aggressive confrontations. Plantation records from this period, discovered in the 1973 archives, show Broussard's handwriting deteriorating, his account entries becoming scattered and illegible. Letters he wrote to business associates became rambling and hostile. Looking back with modern medical knowledge, Broussard was likely suffering from late-stage syphilis, a disease that was epidemic in the antebellum South and caused progressive neurological damage, personality changes, and cognitive decline in its final stages. But in 1821, no one understood what was happening. They just saw a man losing his mind. Catherine was terrified. Her husband was destroying everything. She had no legal power to stop him, and if he died or the plantation failed, she would be left destitute.
That's when Moses made his first move. Moses's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He would use the plantation's debt to create a situation where he became indispensable. Then he would engineer Broussard's death in a way that appeared natural or accidental. Then he would position himself to take control of the property. Moses began accidentally letting creditors know about other creditors. He would be in New Orleans on plantation business and happened to mention to creditor A that creditor B was demanding payment. This created
panic. Creditors began calling in loans simultaneously, all afraid of being the last one paid if the plantation failed. By late 1821, Broussard was facing a liquidity crisis. He didn't have enough cash on hand to pay all the immediate demands. He was forced to sell assets at fire sale prices, livestock, equipment, parcels of land. Moses suggested to Catherine that she convince Broussard to let Moses handle creditor negotiations. Moses's argument was pragmatic. Broussard was too emotional, too confrontational. He was making creditors angry, which made them less willing to extend payment terms. But Moses could negotiate calmly, buy them time. Catherine convinced her husband. Broussard, increasingly unable to focus on business details due to his cognitive decline, agreed. Moses began negotiating with creditors, not to pay them off, but to restructure payment schedules in ways that created dependencies. He would convince creditor A to accept partial payment now in exchange for a line on specific property. He would get creditor B to agree to extended terms if they were given priority claim on the sugar harvest. He would persuade creditor C to consolidate multiple debts into a single note with complex conditions. The result was a web of overlapping claims, cross-collateralized debts, and conditional payments that only Moses fully understood. He kept impeccable records, but records only he could interpret. The plantation's finances became so complicated that Moses became the only person who could navigate them. William Broussard's condition worsened throughout 1822. His paranoia intensified. He accused workers of theft, creditors of conspiracy, neighbors of plotting against him. He fired and rehired overseers 3 times in 6 months. He would disappear for days on drinking binges, returning disoriented and violent. In July 1822, Broussard became convinced that Moses was stealing from him. He had no evidence. In fact, Moses's records were meticulous, but the paranoia had taken hold. Broussard confronted Moses in the plantation office, accused him of embezzlement, threatened to have him whipped and sold. Moses remained calm. He pulled out the account books and walked Broussard through every entry, showing him that everything was documented and accounted for. Moses even pointed out several ways he'd actually saved Broussard money through clever negotiations with creditors. Broussard, confused and unable to follow the complex accounting, backed down. But the incident rattled him. That night, he told Catherine he didn't trust Moses anymore. He wanted Moses sold. Catherine argued against it forcefully. She told her husband that Moses was the only person keeping their creditors from seizing the property immediately. If Moses left, they would lose everything within weeks. This was true, and Broussard, in a rare moment of clarity, knew it. But it also meant that Broussard was now a prisoner of his own debt, dependent on an enslaved man he didn't trust, trapped in a situation he couldn't escape. That's when Moses executed the final step. On August 14, 1822, William Broussard went out to inspect the sugarcane fields along the river. It was mid-morning, hot, humid. He was accompanied by Moses, who was reviewing production estimates. They were standing on a levee bank overlooking a drainage canal, a deep channel cut into the swampy ground to control flooding. The canal was about 12 feet deep, filled with brackish water, overgrown with vegetation. According to Moses's later testimony, Broussard suffered a sudden seizure. He collapsed, fell backwards into the canal, and drowned before Moses could pull him out. Broussard's body was recovered 2 hours later. The local doctor examined the body and found evidence consistent with drowning. He also noted signs of advanced syphilis, skin lesions, neurological damage. The doctor concluded that Broussard had likely suffered a seizure related to his disease and fell into the water. The death was ruled accidental. But here's what the 1973 archival discovery revealed. 3 enslaved people witnessed the incident from a distance. Their testimonies were never recorded officially in 1822. Enslaved people couldn't testify in court against white people. But 50 years later, after emancipation, 2 of those witnesses gave interviews to a Freedmen's Bureau agent who was collecting oral histories. Both witnesses told the same story. They saw Moses and Broussard talking at the levee. They saw what appeared to be an argument, Broussard gesturing angrily, Moses standing very still. Then Broussard turned his back, and Moses pushed him, not violently, just a firm shove to the upper back, enough to send Broussard stumbling forward, losing his balance on the muddy levee slope, falling into the canal. Moses waited. He watched Broussard thrash in the water for 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Broussard was weak, disoriented from disease, unable to swim effectively. Moses could have pulled him out easily. He didn't. Moses stood on the levee and watched William Broussard drown. Then he ran for help, arriving back at the plantation house out of breath, shouting that there'd been an accident, that the master had fallen into the canal. By the time help arrived, Broussard was dead. The witnesses never spoke up in 1822. Why would they? They were enslaved. Their testimony would never be believed, and speaking up might result in their own punishment, suspicious deaths, sales to harsher plantations. They kept silent, and Moses walked free. Catherine Broussard was now a widow with a failing plantation, crushing debt, and no legal authority to manage property, and no male relatives willing to take over the operation. Under Louisiana law at the time, Catherine technically inherited the plantation as Broussard's widow, but she couldn't operate it independently. She needed either a male relative to manage it, or she needed to remarry quickly to someone who could. She had no viable options. Her father was dead. Her brothers were in New Orleans with their own businesses and no interest in taking over a debt-ridden sugar plantation in the swamps. Other plantation owners in the area were aware of Broussard's debts and wanted nothing to do with the property. Catherine was going to lose everything unless, 3 weeks after Broussard's funeral, Moses approached Catherine with a proposal. Not a marriage proposal, not yet, a business proposal. Moses laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The creditors were going to force a sale of the property within months. Everything would go to auction. Catherine would be left with nothing, possibly even liable for remaining debts. But there was a loophole. If the plantation could be restructured under new ownership, specifically ownership by someone the creditors believed could make the operation profitable, the creditors might agree to restructured payment terms instead of forcing immediate sale. Catherine understood where this was going. Moses proposed that he be granted manumission, legal freedom. Then, as a free person of color, he could formally take over management of the plantation. Creditors knew Moses had been running the operation's finances successfully for years. They might accept him as manager if it meant they'd eventually get paid. But there was a problem. Louisiana law in 1822 was complex regarding property ownership by free people of color. Moses couldn't simply purchase the plantation. He had no money, and even if he did, the racial restrictions on property transfer would make it nearly impossible. The solution was marriage. If Catherine married Moses, the property would remain legally hers, but Moses could operate it with full authority as her husband. Under coverture laws, a husband controlled all marital property. Moses would have legal authority to manage the plantation, negotiate with creditors, and operate the business while Catherine maintained technical ownership. It was insane, illegal in many states, barely legal in Louisiana, which had more flexible laws regarding free people of color due to its French-Spanish colonial heritage, and it required Catherine to do something absolutely scandalous: marry a former slave, a black man, just weeks after her white husband's death. Catherine agreed, not because she loved Moses, not because she felt grateful, but because it was the only way to survive. On September 12, 1822, less than a month after William Broussard's death, Catherine Broussard and Moses, who took the surname Broussard, at this point, though some documents list him as Moses LeBlanc, were married in a small civil ceremony in St. Mary Parish. The marriage certificate exists in parish records. It lists Moses as free person of color, formerly enslaved, manumitted by declaration of Catherine Broussard, widow. The white community was shocked. But here's the remarkable part: they didn't stop it. Why? The reason the white community allowed this marriage and the reason Moses's entire scheme worked comes down to money.
And self-interest. The creditors owed money by the Broussard plantation were mostly merchants and bankers in New Orleans and nearby parishes. They had two options: force the plantation into bankruptcy, seize the property, and sell it at auction. This would likely result in a loss. Debt-burdened properties sold at auction typically went for far less than their actual value. Plus, the auction process would take time and legal costs. Allow Moses to take over operations, restructure the debts, and get paid back over time. Moses had spent the weeks after Broussard's death meeting with creditors individually. He showed them detailed plans for how he would increase productivity, reduce costs, and generate the cash flow needed to service the debts. He pointed out that he'd been running the plantation's finances successfully for years. Broussard had just been the figurehead. The creditors believed him because it was true. They made a calculation. They were more likely to recover their money if Moses ran the plantation than if they forced a bankruptcy auction. So they agreed to restructured payment terms. Moses convinced them to consolidate the debts, extend payment schedules, and reduce interest rates in exchange for guaranteed revenue shares from future harvests. And the marriage to Catherine gave Moses the legal authority to enforce these arrangements. The local white community, plantation owners, parish officials, merchants, were scandalized by the marriage, but they didn't legally challenge it because it was technically legal under Louisiana's Free People of Color laws. The creditors supported it. Dumb money trumped racial sensibilities. Catherine herself consented. She couldn't be forced into a marriage. Challenging it would create a legal mess that might trigger the plantation's collapse, destabilizing the local economy. So they let it happen. With grumbling, with social ostracism of Catherine, with whispered outrage, but no legal action. Moses had exploited the one thing more powerful than racial hierarchy: property rights and financial self-interest. Over the next 3 years, Moses ran the plantation with ruthless efficiency. He cut costs, increased sugar production, and negotiated favorable contracts with buyers. He paid down debts ahead of schedule. By 1825, the plantation was profitable, and most of the major creditors had been satisfied. And Moses, born enslaved, purchased for $986, now effectively owned an 800-acre sugar plantation worth approximately $20,000 in today's dollars. Catherine and Moses's marriage lasted until Catherine's death in 1834. During those 12 years, they operated the plantation together, though by all accounts it was a business partnership, not a romantic relationship. They had no children together. They lived in separate wings of the plantation house. Catherine managed household affairs. Moses managed everything else. Catherine's death in 1834 transferred full legal ownership to Moses. He continued operating the plantation successfully until 1841, when he sold it for $32,000, a substantial profit, and moved to Texas. Why Texas? Because in 1836, Texas had declared independence from Mexico and was operating as an independent republic with relatively loose regulations about property ownership by free people of color. Moses purchased land near Houston and established a smaller farming operation. He lived there until his
Death in 1854, at approximately 62 years old, he died a free man, a landowner, and relatively wealthy. But here's when the story gets complicated. Moses tried to keep his history quiet. In Texas, he went by O.M. Broussard, or sometimes Moses LeBlanc. He didn't advertise that he'd been enslaved. He didn't talk about William Broussard's death. He presented himself as a Louisiana-born free person of color who'd built a successful business. Most of his white neighbors in Texas never knew the truth, but the black community knew. Enslaved people in Louisiana had known, and when they were freed, they told the story. Moses became a legend, the slave who killed his master, married the widow, and took the plantation. The story was told in slave quarters across Louisiana and Texas. It was whispered, embellished, mythologized. Some versions had Moses as a warrior who'd fought his master in single combat. Some had him as a trickster who'd outwitted the white man. Some had him as a lover who'd seduced the widow. The truth was less romantic, but more remarkable. Moses had used intelligence, patience, and an understanding of legal and financial systems to engineer his freedom and his revenge. For 150 years, the story remained folklore. Historians dismissed it as fiction, a wish-fulfillment fantasy with no basis in reality. But in 1973, a graduate student named James Whitfield was researching land ownership patterns in southern Louisiana for his dissertation. He was going through property transfer records in Sitan Mary Parish archives when he found something strange. A deed transfer in 1841 where the seller was listed as Moses Broussard, formerly enslaved free person of color. Whitfield started digging. He found the 1822 marriage certificate between Catherine Broussard and Moses, Catherine's manumitted decoration, fracturing agreements signed by Moses in 1822 at her firing labeling Moses as plantation manager. The 1834 will of Catherine Broussard leaving all her property to Moses, to slave people who lived on the road between Moses. Whitfield published his findings in 1975 in an academic journal article titled Moses Broussard, An Enslaved Man's Path to Property Ownership in Antebellum, Louisiana. The article received little attention outside academic circles. It was published in a specialized journal focused on Louisiana history. But in the 1980s and 1990s, as scholars began paying more attention to stories of black resistance and economic success during slavery, Moses' story was rediscovered. It appeared in several books on black entrepreneurship and resistance. A documentary filmmaker tried to option the story in 2003 but couldn't secure funding. And gradually, among historians who study slavery and resistance, Moses Broussard's story became recognized as one of the most extraordinary cases of enslaved resistance and economic mobility in American history. So what do we make of Moses? He was, by any measure, brilliant. He understood legal systems, financial instruments, and human psychology well enough to engineer his freedom in a system designed to make that impossible. He was patient. His plan took years. He waited for the perfect moment. He didn't act rashly. He was ruthless. He killed a man. Yes, a man who enslaved him, who owned him, who would never have freed him voluntarily. But he killed him.
Nonetheless, calculated, deliberate, cold-blooded, and he was lucky. He exploited a very specific set of circumstances: a master who was mentally deteriorating, a widow with no male relatives, a legal system just flexible enough to allow his marriage to Catherine, creditors who cared more about money than racial purity, and a location, Louisiana, with laws that were slightly more permissive regarding free people of color than most slave states. If any one of those factors had been different, Moses would have been caught
executed, or simply remained enslaved until death or emancipation. But they weren't different, and Moses exploited every single advantage with precision. The story raises uncomfortable questions. Was Moses justified in killing William Broussard from a moral standpoint? Was an enslaved person defending themselves against their enslaver, even through premeditated killing, an act of self-defense, or murder? Was Catherine complicit in her husband's death? Did she know what Moses had done? The historical record suggests she probably suspected, but chose not to ask questions. Was marrying Moses an act of survival, pragmatism, or something darker? And what about the white community that allowed this to happen? They let a black man marry a white woman, inherit a plantation, and operate freely in Louisiana society for over a decade. Not because they'd suddenly become enlightened about race, but because it served their financial interests. What does that tell us about the real priorities of the antebellum South? Moses' story doesn't fit neatly into any simple narrative. He wasn't a pure hero, he was a killer. But he wasn't a villain either. He was a man fighting for freedom in a system that gave him no legal options. He represents something rarely discussed in histories of slavery: the enslaved person who didn't just resist, but who actually won, who took everything from their oppressor, who died free, wealthy, and successful. And perhaps that's why his story became legend, because for enslaved people living under an impossible system, Moses represented the ultimate fantasy. Not just escape, not just freedom, but total victory. The slave who killed his master, married the widow, and became the plantation owner.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more similar stories, subscribe to the channel right now. Like the video and share your thoughts with us in the comments section.